There she is. So, yes, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to the conversation. We are delighted to have Nick Mathews with us today. Nick is a journalism professor at the University of Missouri, and he's also an author of an upcoming book about life without local news in rural America. So, he focuses a lot on rural journalism, local news sustainability, relationship building between communities and the institutions that serve them. So today's conversation, it's going to explore a lot of those relationship buildings and what does it actually look like in practice, especially in places with shrinking infrastructure, limited capacity, and the growing distrust from the audience. A few housekeeping things before I toss it over to Nick. The chat is open, so feel free to introduce yourselves, comment in there, chat. We also have a recording of this, and so we will be posting this on the event page afterwards. And then Nick also mentioned that he is very open to this being a conversation, casual. So you can feel free to add comments on the chat, but also feel free to raise your little virtual hand if you want to unmute yourself and contribute to the conversation. So this is very casual. Feel free to chime in as we go along. So with all of that said, Nick, thank you so much for being here again. And I'm going to hand it over to you to get us started.
That sounds very good, and I greatly appreciate the invitation to speak. And yeah, as mentioned, please let this be as informal as we possibly can. So I do appreciate that. Bear with me 1 second. I want to get everything set up, and everybody can see my screen. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Then I am going to get going. So I'd like to start with a story about a guy named Kyle. Kyle is the owner, publisher, editor, lead reporter at a small rural weekly publication in Virginia. So on Mondays and Tuesdays, Kyle's the advertising rep. On Wednesdays, he's the circulation manager and delivery supervisor. And, by Friday evenings, he's the janitor. So Kyle isn't just running a news organization. Kyle is the news organization. So no staff, no backup, just him. So Kyle works and lives and breathes very much and occasionally suffocates inside a fishbowl, a place where everybody is watching and there's nowhere to hide. So Kyle told me a very specific story about one day when he found himself in the fishbowl. It was a Friday evening at the county fair years ago when the park just overflowed with community members. He left his office after his Friday evening office cleaning, and he went to meet his wife for a corn dog, a funnel cake, and frankly, a much needed beer. So Kyle got a parking spot in near the festival, shut off his car engine, and then froze. Suddenly, surprisingly, inexplicably, unable to muster the will to leave his car. I was overwhelmed with the idea of walking through the park, Kyle told me. I just knew someone was going to want something from me. My mind was all over the place. Do I have to engage in conversation with everyone I see? Can I just nod hello? Is there a way to appear approachable without inviting others to actually approach me? Am I working now? When am I not working? Am I ever not working? All he wanted was a simple beer with his wife in the park. But walking to her was like walking through a minefield. I know I am supposed to want to talk to people. Sometimes I don't want to meet anybody. I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to hear your stupid story idea that only you care about, he said. Sometimes I don't want to deal with people. That Friday night was one of those nights. Kyle said he absolutely loves owning the paper. I have the best job in the world, he said. But on that Friday night, in his car, he almost cried. And I never cry, he said. Kyle believed that as soon as he stepped out of that car, he became Kyle the journalist. You can't just be yourself, he told me. You have to be this persona, this other thing. In the end, Kyle walked through the park, halted by just one person who indeed had a story idea. And it was a stupid idea, Kyle told me. But he entertained the community member, and then finally joined his wife. Best beer ever, he said. Here's the tension I really want us to wrestle with today. On one hand, as I will explain later, audiences increasingly want to know journalists, not as bylines, but as people. People who work, live, and participate in the very communities they cover. They want a connection. But on the other hand, as the story of Kyle in the Park certainly demonstrates, journalists don't always feel they can or should be on. In those moments, they choose distance, sometimes physical distance, sometimes emotional distance, often necessary over connection. And that's where this tension lies, where it really lives, between personal boundaries and public connection, between presence and privacy. Many of the examples I'm going to share here are from rural spaces, places where the need for journalism is urgent, immediate, and frankly undeniable. But this really is not just a story about rural journalism at all. It's a small news story in many ways. It's a story of weekly newspapers in remote corners of this country, neighborhood outlets from New York City to Los Angeles, and topic-specific nonprofit startups built on passion and precarity. Different settings, but the same struggles in many ways. These are institutions where the line between journalists and audience members is virtually invisible. Which is why this talk today really isn't about only journalists. It isn't about just audiences. It's about the relationship between them, intertwined, interdependent, increasingly strained, at a moment when local journalism itself is indeed fragile. Some will side with the audience, believing connection is not only expected but deserved. Others may side with the journalist, recognizing the need for space, for separation, and for a self beyond the story. Both perspectives carry weight. Both deserve to be heard. And they lead us into the questions of the center at the talk, really. Questions rooted in attention shaped in lived experiences and central to a broader, urgent conversation about sustainability, responsibility, accountability, and the mental well-being of the people doing this work. People like many of you in this room today. So before I go any further, let me just kind of briefly situate myself a little bit in this conversation. You heard earlier from the generous introduction, so I won't repeat much of it, but I do want to give a sense of kind of my path in this, how this brings me here today. As mentioned, my name is Nick Mathews. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Journalism at the University of Missouri. Now, my relationship with the Mizzou Mafia, as we like to call it here, goes back a long way. I graduated from Missouri in the year in 20 graduated from Mizzou in 2001, and then spent nearly 2 decades in the newsroom. I started in sports, moving from paper to paper until I eventually became the youngest sports editor in the history of the Houston Chronicle. From there, I moved to be a regional editor-in-chief in Central Virginia, overseeing the multiple daily and multiple weekly news operations based out of Charlottesville, Virginia. So it was there in those small newsrooms and tight-knit communities where something really clicked for me, where I developed a deep respect for rural journalism in particular, and an even deeper admiration for the journalists who are doing that work on every single day. Then at 40, as one does, I made a turn. I left journalism, went back to graduate school, and started a PhD program at the University of Minnesota. I began asking questions about the industry I spent my life in since the day I turned 16 years old. After finishing the graduate studies, I spent a year at the University of Missouri, Kansas City before returning here to Mizzou. As I mentioned, my work focuses on news deserts, a line of research I actually began in 2019 while I was still working full-time in a newsroom and starting my master's degree. More specifically, I study what it actually means to live without local news. Now, I don't need to persuade this room that journalism matters. We already believe in its power, how it informs our decisions, strengthens our civic life, and sustains our sense of community. But what my research shows is this: when local news disappears, The loss is not just noticeable, it's layered, it's lasting, and deeply human. I argue it unfolds on three different levels: informational loss, communal loss, and personal loss. First, informational loss. People lose the steady stream of reliable, relevant, and routine information that helps make sense of their world. And in its place, they take on new work themselves, what I call informational labor, searching, sorting, stitching together what they find. They become, out of necessity, their own reporters. As one person told me, life is harder without a local news organization. Second is communal loss. Without local news, communities lose a shared space, a common story, and a collective sense of self. They go uncelebrated in good times, undefended in bad times, and too often misunderstood by those outside. And people feel that sense of absence is sharp in simple terms. It's like nobody cares about our little town, one person told me. Or even more starkly, like we don't matter. And I think about this finally in personal loss. This one is quieter, but no less profound. Because for many, the newspaper was more than a product. It was a presence, a personal ritual. One participant told me, I missed the newspaper. I spent hours slowly thumbing through it every week. It was, in his words, just me and my paper, no distractions. This was an older gentleman. He had no family left. Just that weekly connection with the printed product. And when that paper closed, he said it was, quote, like losing a loved one. So when we talk about news deserts, we're not just talking about missing news organizations or missing newspapers. We're talking about harder lives, weaker ties, and quieter losses. We're talking about what happens when information fades, when communities fracture, and when people begin to feel in very real ways forgotten. I also study what I like to call, or what I call lived news deserts. Not places where news is gone, but places where it feels gone. Communities where a news organization exists, but connection does not. Where a paper may still print, but it no longer belongs. Others have called these ghost newspapers, local in name only, but not in the life of the community. In one community I studied, residents pointed to a pattern. They point to a pattern of distance, of detachment, and of disconnection. Ownership was outside the community. Content was about life outside the community. And too often, the journalists themselves lived outside the community. But it's that last piece that's the most powerful and frankly the most painful. But what I heard time and time again, it wasn't about geography. It was about presence. One resident told me there's just so much difference when you actually live in a community. It's hard to really be a part of it when you don't. Another asks a simple but searing question. How tethered are they to the community if they don't even live there? And that absence, they told me, shows up in the journalism itself. It feels, as one person said, like somebody from outside writing about the inside. Because frankly, that's what it was. The stories weren't about them. The voices in the paper weren't from them. And the people telling those stories weren't one of them. And so the paper, though present, felt peripheral. Present but not personal. Available but not accountable. Visible perhaps, but not vital to the community in any way. It was, as one resident told me, they said it was for us, but not from us. And this is what I write about, really. Audiences who feel, as my book title suggests, deserted by local news. But what really struck me from the stories that I've heard from people were those stories about what it could be. One person told me about about visiting another small town in Virginia, going to a community event and seeing that town's local newspaper owner sitting in a dunk tank, raising money for a food bank, laughing with residents, fully a part of the community moment. People lined up to dunk him, joked with him, recognized him, knew him. And the response I heard in the community I was observing was very simple but very striking. That would never happen here. Then came the line that really stuck with me. I don't need to talk to them in thinking of the journalists. I don't need to talk to the journalists. I just want to see them being part of our community. And that's the lesson I think that matters for every journalist. People want information, news, and coverage, of course. They also want a connection. They want to know you, to see you, to trust you. And that's not the cost of journalism. It's the privilege of it. Which brings me back to journalists like Kyle. Journalists who, in small choices and fleeting moments, quietly widen the distance between themselves and the very communities they cover. So I want to share a few stories here. And I suspect that many of them will feel familiar to us in this room. I know they do for me. For many of the journalists I've spoken with, their home is not just a home, it's a hiding place. One described himself as a hermit. I am the most boring person in the world. I try never to leave my house if I don't have to. Solitude for him is not loneliness, it's relief. No people, he said. It's all I need. Before the incident in the park, Kyle used to drift through the community bars and local restaurants, just part of the daily life of the community. Now, he said, I usually just hide away at home. That shift was noticeable to his wife, who enjoys still going out and being a part of the social fabric of their community. That he completely strains against. She'll get annoyed with me for wanting to hide away, he said. But nobody bothers her. Everybody comes up to me. So she goes out, he stays in, and as he says in his own words, I'm happier at home. Another owner told me she sends my husband out for milk if ever needed. Because if she goes out, she said, she won't just buy milk, she'll field requests, take story pitches, absorb expectations until a 5-minute errand turns into an hour-long obligation. It takes freaking forever to get back home, she told me. Sometimes she simply doesn't have the bandwidth for being known. So they retreat, not in grand gestures, but in quiet ones, in lives carefully curated for calm, quiet, and control, in early exits and skipped events. One editor told me he attended the county's biggest festival just last year. I guess it would have been 2 years ago now. Briefly, dutifully, strategically. He showed up for the opening ceremonies, exchanged the necessary greetings as the event's primary financial sponsor, and then disappeared. I did my bit and ran away, he said. It's not my thing. And no, you will not find him in the dunk tank. That's a role for someone comfortable being recognized, splashed, and celebrated, not for someone trained to avoid all three. And then there's Kyle again. Because even an escape can't really be an escape. Twice a year, he and his wife try to get away. Caribbean trips, short and carefully scheduled. They leave their Virginia home early, drive to Washington, D.C., and even there, 3 hours removed at the airport, he's still scanning for faces, still calculating risks, still wondering who might recognize him. There's a chance I'll see someone I know, he said. It's only once he's on the plane, once wheels lift and the world drops away, that something shifts. He said, once we're in the air and I have a mimosa in hand, I'm a different person. At the resort, he performs anonymity. I'm an accountant if anybody asks, he said. Nobody asks questions of an accountant. He talks politics, soccer, weather, anything but the work that defines him. It's great to be where nobody knows me, he said. I can be me. And yet, even there, even in that anonymity, he is not entirely unburdened. Work is always there, always in the back of my mind, he admits. I try to break free, but I can't break free completely. And this is the paradox. He leaves the community, but the community does not leave him. I share these stories about Kyle, which, by the way, is not his real name, but his very real tension, because I recognize pieces of it in myself. I can imagine being paralyzed in the park. I had hidden in my house while my wife went out to socialize. I have told stories and versions of my own stories where it felt easier to say I was anything but a journalist. And I suspect I'm not alone with Kyle. Because that's what journalism is, and especially rural journalism, how it can feel at times. The work is deeply personal, the relationships are close, and the line between professional and personal is often thin, if it even exists at all. Journalism is not something you do, especially in smaller communities. It becomes part of how people see you, know you, and remember you. We talk about journalism as a presence, but sometimes it feels like pressure. My point overall is that journalism, especially journalism in small newsrooms and small communities, is not a walk in the park. I started about 20 minutes or so ago about identifying attention. Audiences increasingly want a connection with journalists. They want to be able to dunk them in the dunk tank. Journalists increasingly need and at times deserve disconnection. So the question is obvious, even if the answer is not. How do we reconcile this? And I'll certainly be honest with you, I don't have a clean answer because this is not a problem with a single solution. It is personal, it is professional, it is communal, it's contextual. It shifts depending on the journalist, the newsroom, and the community. Which leads to an even deeper question. What is the path out of the desert? And here I want to be careful not to overpromise clarity when none exists. There are nearly 18,000 incorporated communities in the United States with fewer than 25,000 people. And that doesn't even include the thousands of places that don't clearly make it onto the map. That means there are 18,000 different histories, economies, cultures, expectations, and relationships with local news. So there is no single fix, no universal blueprint. At best, there are 18,000 variations of the same question. So that's why I'm certainly hesitant to offer any prescription. But I will say at its core, journalism is relational, not transactional, not extractive, relational. So what does that mean in practice? Meet people. Meet all of the people. Host an event, then host another. Host a listening session, then host another. Many of you, I'm preaching to the choir here because you're doing this work already. But that work matters more than we often give it credit for. And then do something with what you hear. Not performatively, not occasionally, but consistently and responsibly. When I was an editor in Charlottesville, I hosted a monthly Brews and News with community members. It was simple, it was unglamorous, and it was one of the most meaningful parts of the work there. In Reviving Rural News, we tell the story of Joey and Lindsay Young, a husband and wife team running a newspaper in Newton, Kansas. They host monthly mingles in their office. No agenda, no stage, no barrier, just people. Sometimes 75, sometimes 100, every month without fail. And for them, it became something rare in modern journalism, a consistent reminder that people don't just want to read the paper, they care about the people behind it. This photo that's actually on the screen right now is from one of their mingles. As Lindsay put it, it's been fun to actually see that we have some fans in the community. So now in journalism, we often think in big terms, big investigations, big coverage, big crisis, big fixes, and even in times, bigger impulses. Let's burn it all down and start over. And yet this conversation today touches on many of the big issues as well. News deserts, corporatization, audiences who feel abandoned. But the danger of big thinking is that it can be immobilizing. The scale overwhelms the will to act. That's where psychologists, and I lean on psychologist Carl Weick's idea of small wins. I find it very useful. He argues that when problems are enormous, the most productive response is to shrink the frame, to make actions manageable, visible, and repeatable. Small wins are not small because they're insignificant. They are small because they're doable, and they matter because they accumulate. So the goal is not revolution overnight. It is momentum over time. One listening session, one event, one beer or coffee with a community member, one adjustment in how we show up, then another. Because in journalism, especially, we already know institutions don't shift easily or quickly. So the work is not to fix everything at once. It is to make progress that can be seen, repeated, and sustained. Because small wins will do something powerful. They build confidence, they generate learning, and they make the next step possible. So my invitation and my encouragement, especially to those working in newsrooms, is not to solve everything at once. It is to do something small but real. Then do it again and again. Until those small wins start to add up to something larger than any single decision could produce on its own. For all the tension I've talked about, there is something deeply, undeniably uplifting underneath it all. The fact that audiences want to know journalists, that's awesome. And these small wins that I'm talking about, they matter, they build, and they will compound. One conversation becomes two, two becomes trust, and trust becomes something bigger than any single story. And I want to leave you with one more reason for optimism. At the University of Missouri, I teach 200 to 250 journalism students every semester. This here is one photo from just about a week ago. First year students, intro class, the big questions. What journalism is, why it matters, what role it plays in democracy. And yes, I have the best job in the world. But I'm going to be honest, it might be the easiest. I get to stand in front of a room full of students who are, most days anyway, actually listening, taking notes, nodding along, occasionally even laughing at my jokes. But here's what matters. They believe in this. Even after everything we've talked about today, the loss, the disconnection, the desertion, they still choose journalism. And I'll say this plainly. I believe in the future of journalism because I see it every day. I could not, in good conscience, stand in that classroom, ask them to commit to their lives to this work if I didn't believe the future wasn't real. They are driven, they are determined, they are restless in the best way. They want to hold power accountable, they want to tell stories that matter, and they want to serve communities that are too often overlooked. And maybe most importantly, they're not just dreaming about the coast or big cities either. Many of them want to go home. They want to go back to small towns, back to the rural communities, back to the very places we worry most about, to be honest. And they don't just want to work in journalism. They want to build it. They want to build something, to start something, to sustain something, to be something. Journalism isn't dying, despite what others around our world will tell us. Journalism is not dying. It is being rebuilt, student by student, story by story, community by community. What I see in them is not nostalgia for what journalism was, but a commitment to what it still can be. And I see it every single day, and I love it. Thank you.
Well, that was a very, very good intro. Thank you so much for sharing all of these perspectives and stories, Nick. For folks in the room, feel free to post any questions or comments on the chat for Nick. We're going to get started with the conversation portion of this. And if you're feeling up for it, you can also raise your virtual hand and unmute yourself so that we can have a discussion. While that happens, while folks do that, I'm going to go ahead and launch a little poll that I created for this conversation. Yep. Okay. So what I'm trying to see with this poll is see where the tension for most folks is. So we have the question is what feels hardest right now for your organization? And the options that we are giving are sustaining engagement over time, building audience trust, capacity and bandwidth, revenue funding pressures, and maintaining boundaries while staying present in your community. So I'm gonna leave this up for a second, and then I'm going to go ahead and share the answers. Oh, can I share here?
You want me to stop sharing?
I mean, if you want to, that way you can like see the screen, but you don't have to. I'm gonna go ahead and share these results. So of course, I mean, I'm actually not surprised at all to see that, revenue and funding pressures are a big portion of this as well. You actually said, I think you mentioned either right now or when you and I spoke on Monday that journalism is relational, right? And a lot of organizations and journalists are being asked to deepen that trust with their communities, especially in these rural areas. They're being asked to expand their engagement, generate more reader support, all of these things at the same time. So, Nick, my question for you would be like, how do you think organizations should approach that tension between relationship building with their communities and sustainability without making that audience relationship feel transactional, right? Because there's some tension there. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That's one of the great things I've witnessed, especially when we were doing the work in Kansas. It was their like the report, like they had their entire staff in the newsroom there, and they hosted people in their office, which was awesome to see. But there was like zero notebooks out, nothing like that. It was just talking, purely. It was to your point. It wasn't. It felt genuine. Like, I mean, it was very much many people in that newsroom who didn't know some of the folks who were in their office. They just didn't know them. But I mean, it was just so very genuine. I thought that was the thing that meant the most. It was authentic. It was just saying, I just want to get to know you as a person. I mean, some of this, like, I was there. I was there when they did their first one. And some of you just hear great story ideas just from conversations with people. So, but it's not transactional and it's not extractive because you're really doing your best to just kind of introduce yourself to get to the thing that is so important, especially in these rural areas, is people will still say the lying media. They just will. But they're not going, but even when they're going to say that in another breath, they're going to say, you know what, but our media is different. They're going to think about it that way. They're going to think about national media as lying media, etc. But they're still going to believe in the local product. I mean, there's a juxtaposition there that is insane to explore. But I mean, how they actually still think about because they have individual personal relationships with some of the journalists there. It's incredibly valuable. Now, in terms of the tension, I think that's the part that is so unique because I mean, is the best way that you can actually make these relational parts of the job part of the job. So, like, have them in your office, to close a Friday for, I'm making that up, but having them in your office on a Friday, you're not adding more to your workload. You're actually bringing people into your normal environment. Those kinds of things were, especially for some folks, is just beneficial. So it's not additive work, it's actually just becoming part of your job.
I love that you mentioned that portion about it not being additive
Mm.
work because I think you have mentioned earlier that during your opener story about Kyle, you mentioned that he worked in circulation. And I know at some point you also mentioned that everybody works in
Right.
circulation. But how does that mindset changes the way that newsroom, that newsrooms and people in newsrooms interact with their roles, right? Um, can you go a little bit deeper into what you mean when you say that everybody works in circulation?
Yeah, no, I mean that's a line I've been using since I was in news when I was the editor of the newspapers. Is that because it was just an opportunity. Everybody's in circulation because you're trying to, for one, you're trying to get subscriptions and sell a product here too. But you're also building those relationships with as many people as possible. I mean, it's not just everybody works in circulation. In an organization like this, or especially many of them, everybody works in development. Everybody works in philanthropy. Everybody works in advertising. Like you have to be able to think you are always a representative of that news organization. And frankly, you're spreading the brand and name of that news organization at all times, even when you're not doing anything editorially. And so how people it's almost that is something that needs to come from publisher, owner, news organization founder. That needs to come from that we are all in this to represent our brand as best we can. And then it's really, again, it's trying to make it where people just it's just second nature. It's not anything that feels forced. It just feels like it's part of your job. And that's where I'm so hesitant to be prescriptive because it's so different for like what kind of an event works. I don't know, what kind of community is it? A conservative community probably wouldn't like if you were having a beer party. I mean, those kinds of things. So it's different by the person, different by the community, how comfortable you are. When I was in that kind of job and where I am now, I wear a University of Missouri School of Journalism t-shirts everywhere. Like I'm happy to be representative of my university. And so some people are not comfortable with that. And that's exactly this tension that I mean I was talking about is it's so deeply personal and so deeply individual. But um, a line that I didn't actually say, but it is very true, is that this type of journalism, rural journalism, small newsroom journalism, it's not for everybody.
Mm. So who is it for?
Those who are willing to do what we're talking about,
Mm.
you know. Um, and that's something I definitely talk to my students about. Um, not everybody is meant to be a journalist. Not everybody is meant to be, especially working in a nonprofit startup or in a smaller news organization. Not everybody's meant to do that. And especially, I mean, a line I use for my students is like it's better for them to find out what right now they're exploring or they're finding out what they don't want to do versus what they do want to do. But here in a little while, I mean, they're going to start to figure out, no, 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 this is what I meant to do. Um, and so that's where, I write about the fishbowl effect of being in a rural journalism, for instance. You just have to be comfortable with that, in many ways. Maybe it's not fair. Probably isn't fair. But I mean, again, I can definitely speak to it because, I remember, when I was in Virginia, like I definitely were times when I was the editor of the newspaper, I had just told my wife, I was like, okay, I want to stay in this weekend. And I'm pretty extroverted. Like I'm happy to do it, but sometimes you're just not.
So a lot of the folks in this group actually, we had this prompt question during the registration process for this, where we asked folks how are they engaging with their communities, what kind of things are they doing, and a lot of them seem to be doing, they understand that meaningful engagement, what it looks like conceptually, right? And a lot of them share that they do events, they engage via newsletters, they do community listening sessions and things like that. But the challenge seems to be more so operationalizing this, right? To make it
Making it a system, right?
right, making it more sustainable, right? Do you have any thoughts on like how organizations can think about that relationship building
Yeah.
when they're feeling so stretched thin, when operationalizing this and making this into a system is
Yeah.
tough?
No, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, that's kind of what I was thinking when I start talking about small wins in particular, because
Mm.
one event is great. It's better than no events, but building on that one event. All right, we'll do another one. We'll do another one. We'll do another one. And so that's where it's actually, I think, especially in smaller organizations or depending on the communities, I think a lot about collaborations. So instead of hosting an event at your office every once the first Friday of a month or something, move it to different businesses in the community. Make them do the work. Help have they have these relationships where instead of, your top advertiser, maybe they're willing to pay a little bit more to actually host your gathering at their business. And so how do we do this and to where we actually are bringing more people to help? Instead of having an event at our space, let's do it at a restaurant. They get to lead. They get to do some of the heavier lifting. But it's building a relational. It's building those relationships with other businesses, with other partners, with fundraiser or with donors even. Like, how do we think about this in terms of this is not just us, this is our community. We are building a community, we're facilitating a community. And how are we actually using our community members and people, like Lindsay said, our fans? How are we using our fans to help us facilitate this?
So is it safe to say that we need to switch the mindset a little bit? Sometimes we think about like these engagement strategies and these things as like an initiative.
Hmm.
It really should be more of like an infrastructure part of the newsroom and the
Yeah, I
organization,
think
right?
so. Yeah, but that's where it gets really hard because say, you know what, but it's more so you can't start off and say, you know what, we're going to do a monthly event every month for the next 3 years if you haven't done one. Like that's where people get so debilitated with the idea of, all right, we can't plan for 6 of these. Well, no. Let's get one, learn from it. Let's do another one in a couple months, and then keep building from there. And then build that system as it goes. To say you want to start with that system without having done any of the actual practice or work, I mean, that's exactly what I was talking about in terms of it just becomes debilitating and becomes overwhelming. It becomes very difficult. And so to think about doing something smaller and let's get this going. I personally love having an open house in your office. If you have an office space, I think it's incredibly valuable. If you don't have an office space, go to a brewery, go to a coffee shop, go to anything in town that would be willing to host your groups of people. Um, and then I love the idea of listening sessions. I completely love the idea of listening sessions. Make them, you can easily do that on a regular basis. That can be during the course of the day. You know what? We're going to do a brown bag lunchtime brown bag. We are going to be talking about cost of living in our community. We're going to be talking about the upcoming school race, anything. Just pick a topic, and you can do that during the course of the day too.
I want to be mindful and open it up to other folks in the room as well, because I know many of you, based on the responses on the registration, are like actively experimenting with, these engagement opportunities and these questions in your own organizations. So feel free to either post on the chat if you don't want to talk, but also feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself if you have any thoughts or questions for Nick.
Hey, Nick. Good to
Hey,
see you,
David.
man.
Good to see you, sir.
I'm at a Cebu event in Philly, so pardon the background. So I did catch the beginning part, and there's a lot I missed. So I don't know if you covered this, but I'm just curious in some of the areas the rural communities that have lost a newspaper that that you've been in touch with or that you've covered. Um, what are people doing to fill that void? Are you finding folks who kind of take on a role as a quasi, journalist or chronicler? Like, what are some of the things that people are doing to fill the gap?
I love that question because it leads to an answer that I absolutely hate to give, but it's absolutely true. In the void of local news, people are turning to global platforms. They're turning to Facebook, they're turning to social media. So it's like, I mean, especially in the communities that I've written about and I've observed, um, one of them is Nelson County, Virginia. And I think I can't remember the exact specifics, but there's something like 14,000 people in the community. But there is a what's happening now in Nelson County or something Nelson Knows is the name of it. Nelson Knows. And there's something like 18,000 people in that Facebook group. I mean, there are more people who are on that Facebook group than actually in the community. And and that's a community that has a newspaper. So, I mean, it's the journalism itself is not, the people just don't see themselves in it. They don't feel it's relevant to their daily lives. So they're essentially making a go around on their own um, on Facebook. I mean, it's insane to hear that local news has been replaced by a global platform, but that's the reality. And and so there, that comes with I mean, everybody has a voice. Everybody in the community has a voice where even within the newspaper, the letters to the editor section's about the only way to get your voice heard. And the perception is it's the same six people who write the same letters every week. So there's not really getting any voice heard. If you write a letter to the editor, for instance, you got to have it grammatically correct, spelling correct. You got to have it, that kind of thing. Facebook, nobody cares. It's authentic. It's real. And so there's reasons why people definitely see the advantages and benefits to it. Um, and so that's that's part of it. And they are sharing, one of the things that really um, I write about and it really upsets me to some extent is that weekly newspapers and smaller community newspapers used to do a wonderful job of celebrating their communities. So you would have photos from, the festival certainly, but just a pretty sunset. You would have photos from families celebrating their 60th anniversary. It's those kinds of weekly journalism and rural products that too many people in, frankly, my jobs critique that they're not relevant, they're not important. But that is community journalism. And so, because so much of that is being ignored, partly because of the lack of resources in terms of personnel in these spaces, people are posting that on Facebook instead. Like I talked to one woman who said that when she had her kid, she's an elderly woman, when she had her kids, the first thing that she thought of was sending an announcement and a photo to the newspaper. Her grandkids were just born not long before I talked to her. She didn't even think about it. She just posted it straight to Facebook. So like how that kind of a connection is there and how people are using it, and frankly, what journalists can learn from it too, and how they actually, one of the things that was the so there were so many people I talked to who when we think about the important independent role that journalists plays in the civic engagement and civic roles, like we're covering city council meetings, we're covering elections, etc. Thinking in that space. So many of the people I talked to said that they don't necessarily trust the journalists who are doing that work because they don't know them. They're not from there. They parachute into their communities only when need be. But they would almost rather get news and information about politics straight from the politicians on Facebook because they know them, they're our neighbors. They don't know the journalists at all. And so that is such an alarming thing to be thinking about. And it really kind of brings back to what I've been saying today is just it sounds so difficult at times, but the smaller the news organizations, frankly, the just more important those personal relationships are. And so those kinds of things can really be learned about how people are navigating a perceived absence of news, even in the presence of local news.
And then you also following up on the trust building of it all. Um, you mentioned that, like emotional distance is not just a geographic distance, but like
Yeah.
an emotional and also an institutional distance, right? So have you seen any examples of organizations that are genuinely able to close those gaps in some of these communities?
Yeah. So, and that becomes so if the owner doesn't live in the community, it becomes hard. Then it goes to the publisher. Somebody near the top of that news organization needs to be able to represent the news organization to the community. And if there's nobody, because some companies, for instance, don't have any, they have regional headquarters. So the people live in the regional headquarters and then parachute in as described to kind of the rural parts of the community to cover events. But it's you just need to have a presence. And so because there's no office there, there's no owner there, there's no nothing along those lines. But that's where it's like, okay, I'm gonna set up shop and I'm gonna be here at the downtown coffee shop from 10 until noon. I'm hosting office hours. I am here. I just want to get a chance to meet people. It's those, frankly, in those communities, it's more difficult when the owner's not involved because the owner's corporate, for instance, or the journalists don't necessarily live there. It takes more effort. It purely does. It takes more effort. But it probably is more important too.
We are approaching time, so I want to make space for anybody else who may have any questions or thoughts for Nick. Um, Feel free to unmute or put it on the chat if you want to share.
How did the poll go?
Oh, did you see it?
I didn't see the result.
Let me see if I can share it. Can you see it now? Share results.
I do. Revenue,
Perfect.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So most people mention revenue and funding pressures, which makes,
Capacity and bandwidth definitely too.
yeah, capacity and bandwidth.
I mean, I do think the revenue actually goes hand in hand with a lot of what we're talking about though.
Right.
Um, we need to get news organizations need to get more revenue from the readers.
And
Obviously,
then
advertising is a struggle in many of these communities. Public notices are going to go away if they haven't already. They're going to lose a large chunk of the revenue, and so it needs to come from the biggest fans, as Lindsay Young described them. So that relationship between the journalist and the audience, the news organization and the audience, is in many ways what's going to fund journalism. I It's one of those things where it's difficult to say, but not every community wants a news organization. And so, we need to get those relationships with businesses, with people who want to support the important work that is being done.
so you mentioned during your presentation, you said, what is the path out of the desert? Do you have any thoughts on what that path could be?
Yeah, so
I
I
think you
tell a
kind of already
story.
answered, but I
Yeah,
want to
no,
hear
but I
more.
do tell a story. So there is Ann Adams, I believe is her name. She had a news organization in northern part of Virginia that was shortly after the pandemic and the heat of the pandemic was on the verge of shutting down. So this woman had been the owner and publisher of her publication for the better part of 30 years. So this is a woman who, when she goes out to lunch in her community, is never not bothered. Somebody is always coming up to her, always talking to her. Um, she enjoys it. That's her job. That's part of her life. So in the height of the pandemic, she wrote a column to her readers that basically said her news organization was facing the hardest deadline it's ever met or it's ever faced. In 5 weeks' time, the news organization was going to close. They were out of money. It was in the pandemic. They were losing advertising. The businesses, the residents, and the readers in that community saved that publication. Businesses bought advertising, subscribers resubscribed, new subscribers came on, donations came in droves, and so much of it is because of those individual relationships that have compounded over 30 years. And so it's not prescriptive because this woman has owned this paper for 30 years, and that's not the case in many community news organizations, of course. But I mean, I kind of say, I talk about what is the path of the desert, following in Adam's footsteps.
Do you have any last thoughts, closing thoughts? We are a few minutes away from closing, so I just want to give you space.
Yeah, I am eager to hear, um, and I'm certainly welcome to emails, phone calls, anything. I am eager to hear how the working journalists here are thinking about this in particular. Um, how we are thinking about building those relationships. We think about relationships so much in journalism. I mean, we think about relationships between reporters and their editors, between advertisers and the businesses, but we so rarely actually think about the personal relationship. And we think about the relationship between journalists and their sources for that matter. Well, we don't necessarily think about the journalists and the consumers or potential consumers. And so how folks are thinking about that. I love events. I love what kinds of events they're doing. Listening sessions are great. Are they doing one-off meetings? Like these kinds of things, I am just eager to learn best practices because I want to do my best to share them loudly for others to see as well. And that's what, the Reynolds Journalism Institute here at the University of Missouri does a lot of work in this space as well to really think about how we can experiment and do better in terms of finances and in terms of relationships.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing these thoughts with us, Nick. This was a very interesting conversation, and it was interesting to see what you learned from your work and your research working on that book. So thank you so much for sharing. And thanks
Thank
for
you.
you folks joining us today. I'm posting on the chat the next talk that we're going to have, which is going to be on June 11. So
Ooh,
if you
what a
want to
great
join
idea
us,
there. I see that idea too.
it's actually an RJI project, I think.
Recognize that. Yeah.
Yes, so you might be familiar with it, but
Yeah.
if you're interested, I just posted a link on the chat. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.